And it's a great joy to be sitting here with you in this beautiful sacred room that you've written for so many years in. And it's a great joy for me personally because you've been one of my dearest friends for almost a quarter of a century. We first met in a Camden bookstore. I'd just written Hidden Journey and you'd just produced Myth of the Goddess, and I think we talked in stereo ecstatically. And since then, not only have you been a very close friend, but the work that you have done has been so influential and enormously inspiring to me, so I thank you from the bottom of my heart. What we're going to do first is to take a journey together through your life, through this life which has led you to be amongst the most important cultural and spiritual philosopher historians of our time. A life which began in England. So tell me a little bit about where you were born and what family you were born to and the character of your two very, very different parents.
Yes, well, I was born in London, right next door to Claridge's, in a house there, and my early years were spent there, and then we moved to the country when I was about 3, I think, and spent a great deal of time in Surrey, in a place called Godalming.
Oh, Godalming.
And it was a lovely Elizabethan house with a lake in front of it, and 2 willow trees, and a beautiful garden, because my grandmother had bought it before she gave it to my parents as a wedding present. And she had designed the garden, and she planned it all very beautifully. So that was something marvellous to grow up with, really, these great borders of flowers designed originally by Gertrude Jekyll.
Good gracious.
Yeah, it was wonderful. And I had a normal early school sort of childhood. I always went to stay with my grandmother in France, and that was the most marvellous time for me, every summer for 2 months. And that's where I first learned French without being aware that I was learning it. I just absorbed it like mother's milk. And I've always been happy speaking French because of that. And then came the war. And we'd been sent to visit my grandmother in America, where she lived just before the war in August 1939. And then, of course, the war broke out and we weren't able to return. But my grandmother, being who she was, she took us back to France in 1940. In the early spring, and we had to leave very abruptly in just before the Germans advanced on Paris. I think it was in May or June 1940. I'm a bit ropey about my dates. Anyway, we then went back to America, and I spent the rest of the war in America, being educated there in wonderful schools, in many different schools, mostly in New York, but also Washington, where I learned French poetry for the first time, because there were 2 amazing old French ladies who taught me about Racine and Ronsard, and made me learn poetry by heart. And that was really, and I took my school certificate there with a lovely English teacher who came to give me lessons. So that's basically my early childhood. And then we went back to England when I was about 14, I think.
Let's look at your parents, because
and
your parents played obviously an archetypal role in your life, and they were totally different people, weren't
yes,
they?
my parents should never have married. But having married, they did the best they could. But there was tremendous tension always, because my mother was wild, ecstatic, poetic, artistic temperament. And my father came from a long line of military people. His father had been a general and had been very strict in the upbringing and everything. And so there were 2 totally different. One was American, the other was English, although actually my father's mother was American as well. So there was a good American element there. But they married when they were both 25, I think, and lived in London and had a tremendous social life. My mother was very beautiful, my father very handsome, they were very popular. And really the trouble didn't start until in the war and then after the war, when the tension between them really got very suffocating. And they were both unhappy, but there was no way that they could resolve the situation.
How did you register that tension as a child? What was it about your father? You once told me he scared you very much sometimes.
He was very frightening, a very powerful man, very quick-tempered man, and very, very destructive of my mother. Even though they both loved each other, he couldn't help it. And I found out later that he'd lost his mother when he was 8 years old, and had had a terrible accident involving his brother, for which he was held responsible. And the combination of the two things, I think, set him into a depression, which was never recognized.
And never treated.
And never treated, because he would be the last person to say that he had depression, to admit such a thing. Because in those days it meant you were mad.
Right.
You didn't say you were depressed.
And on the other hand, your mother had a totally different temperament. She actually won prizes for French poetry.
Yeah, and she was brought up in Paris when she was 17 and 18, spoke fluent French, was educated by a marvellous governess, was offered a place at the Comédie Française, studied with Cortot, the pianist, and could have had a career as a pianist.
Cortot?
Yeah.
My God, Cortot is one of the greatest pianists of all time.
Well, she had a chance to learn with him, but I'm afraid that her father said no, both to the career as an actress and the career as a pianist.
So she was offered a role at the Académie Française.
Yeah.
He said no. She was offered to become a concert pianist under Cortot, and he said no. So she killed her creativity.
Yeah, he killed her creativity without knowing he was doing it. There were many sort of family ramifications to that. Anyway, what it meant was that this very beautiful, very, very gifted artistic and poetic creature found herself living in the English countryside with no one to talk to at all.
And she hated the English countryside.
And she didn't get on. Well, she did. People loved her, and whoever she was with, they loved her. And she was very sweet to everyone, looked after everybody on the estate when we eventually moved to Shropshire.
Knowing you as well as I do, Anne, I know that you have a lot of your father and a lot of your mother in you. I know you have the rigour and the clarity and the discipline and the punctuality. You're massively punctual. And I know, of course, that you have the passionate poetic lyricism of your mother. Yeah. It must have been very difficult in your life to bring those two sides together, especially after you'd seen such misery and unhappiness between your parents.
I think, well, it's taken me until now. Now I'm balanced and I'm happy. But I spent many years, I had depression myself for many years from about the age of 14. And until I had Jungian analysis, that wasn't dealt with at all. Nobody knew what it was, if I was crying all the time and sad and everything. And of course I couldn't give the reason for my sadness to my parents, that the cause of it was their unhappiness.
Right.
So children often can't articulate what the problem is in the family.
Well, in a way you were carrying both parents' depression. You're carrying the guilty past of your father, who had a tragic accident with his brother and lost his mother young, and you were carrying the frustrated creativity of your mother, this agony that she went through when she was not really able to express the fullness of herself. That's a double burden that happened to you.
Of course, I didn't realize all this until I went into analysis later on and talked it all through and understood them both really then, because I could see how he was as frustrated as she was.
Right.
Because to him, she was very frightening, with this emotional woman in the house sort of thing, who perhaps didn't, although she did attend to the food very well, but she wanted to bring her artistic friends home, and he didn't get on with them at all, and they didn't like him because they were frightened of him. So
but let's get back to your childhood, because two really great things happened to you in your childhood, it seems to me. First of all, France and your grandmother's garden and the lushness and sensuality and the revelation of the glory of nature, which you describe so beautifully in Dream of Cosmos.
Yeah.
And the second is what happened to you as a massive initiatory experience when you were 11 years old. Can you talk to us about that?
Yes, that came out of the blue. I was staying in New Hampshire. It was a hot summer day, and I'd gone to rest after lunch. And all of a sudden, I felt the bed open underneath me, and I was pushed through it, and the bed closed over my head. And then I went through this narrow tube with a great rushing and roaring noise for what seemed a long time, until I was sort of spewed out into this great dark black void, which was utterly, utterly terrifying, because I didn't know what had happened, where I was. And I heard a voice saying, "I am," and no more. Because then I was too frightened. I went back through that tube with the roaring and the rushing noise and woke up in my bed, amazed to find that I was there, that I survived
the world still existed, that there was still a reality.
But I knew from that there were two different realities. And that gave the foundation of my life. And then I was introduced to channel messages, which I think I've told you about.
Well, I think this is absolutely... after 11, the channel messages that came to your mother and a group of women happened 2 years later, didn't they?
No, they had actually started then. They had a message after that to explain it. And then there was a gap when we moved in New York to a different place. And then my mother had a great French friend, and she became the the person who wrote down the channel messages.
Well, can you just pause for a little and tell us about these messages, because I've had the honor of reading them and they are amongst the most powerful channel material that I've ever encountered. And these messages played a huge secret part in your life.
Yes.
And this is the first time you're really talking about
yes,
it.
Yes, it's the first time in how many years? I'm now 80 and I had the first message when I was 11 and they went on for 20 years to my mother, not only to me, but to my mother. So that's a long, long time to keep things secret. But there was no one to talk to them about. One simply couldn't share this, either with my school friends, or my mother also had to. They were extremely powerful. They were really almost opening up the age that we're in now. But this was in 1943, in the middle of the last war.
Well, the ones that I've read are directly prophetic of what happened later and of the massive crisis which potentially can destroy everything that we're in now.
Yeah.
And there's an extraordinary experience that you explained to me once, how they began, and the thunder in the room and the massive presence.
I wasn't there at that time. It was my mother and her sister and sister-in-law and this French friend, the four of them. And they suddenly had this extraordinary experience where the window, although it was middle of winter and the windows were shut, it just blew outwards, sort of thing, in a great rush of roar of wind. God. And then they felt a great presence in the room with them, and they fell on their knees and said, "What's happening?" sort of thing. And then they heard a voice speaking to them, and this friend wrote down what the voice said. And that was I was told about that afterwards, but I was certainly not there at the time. And I was about, I suppose, 13 at that time.
How did you feel when your mother told you about the messages?
I was happy. I felt tremendously privileged and included in her group, obviously, and to be so young to be included was amazing. But at the same time, it threw me out of kilter with my school life and my school friends, because there was too huge an abyss between that kind of communication and adjustment to life in the world, passing exams or whatever it might have been. So there were two parallel worlds.
Exactly, and this has been a kind of, not a problem, but a koan for you all your life.
Yeah, it's been a dualism.
You are living a country life, very elegant and calm, and not very social, but in a definite social world. Yeah. And yet you've been carrying this tremendous mystical intensity and revelation all of your life, trying to bring them together.
Yeah, and you're one of the very few people that I've been able to share them with.
Thank you.
And with a few other friends like David Lorimer. But as I say, it had to be kept secret. But now I think it's time to bring them out and speak about them.
Well,
and it's like a missing piece of my life, which is now being included, which for me is very harmonizing of my whole being, because they can now be included.
Well, I've read many of them, and some of them are specific messages to you in which it said you will have a destiny as a teacher, you've got to do deep work on yourself. They're very sober, but very exalting in the end. But the messages that have struck me the most are the messages that came through Jesus.
Yes.
And you have one, I think, that you'd like to read at this moment.
Yes, I have one, yes.
It's a really, really stunning message, which goes to the core, I think, of many of the themes of your life and of your work. Could you share it with us?
Yes. This was to my mother and her friend who was writing it down. Peace be unto you, my daughters. Here I am again in your midst. You are on a higher level. You may not know it yet, but you will feel it later. You have become for a moment perfectly united with me in the word of truth, the word which will never be spoken by human lips, as it is the word of pure spirit. At this moment you have entered consciously the ranks of the pilgrims of light who are slowly proceeding towards the castle where the secret cup is hidden. You may not yet be allowed to contemplate it in your waking consciousness, but at night from now on, whenever you ask of one of my messengers, you will be able to go there and meet in the hall of learning all those kindred spirits you have always desired to contact. More and more the veil of your personality is being torn down, and you are going back to your essence and finding in her your eternal body of light. I am the master of compassion. What does compassion mean? The total conquest of personality, because you feel, endure, and live with everything that in the world has been born of the breath of the Spirit. Witness your new birth, dearest daughters, and be welcomed in the kingdom of the dove, where lies illumined the center of the heart. It is wrong to confuse personality with individuality, as they are two completely different aspects. The Son of Man has shown the individual way back to the Father Godhead. Personality is division, separateness, and illusion, Maya, as my brothers of the East call it. But individuality is the purpose of evolution. Otherwise, God the Father, my Father, would have remained alone in his aloof contemplation of the universe, which he brought forth of his universal mind. Be unique by being all the others and yourself as well. This is the law of compassion, which I brought to the world when I came down 2,000 years ago. Have you thought that this is truly my anniversary, as the cycle has been completed, and I am being reborn as those who are with me are being called to do this same work, but on a new level? That is why this incarnation is so important to you all, as it is the final examination. As babes you came into my arms, as adults we must meet again, and you will bring the fruits of your many trials and tell me, Master, we have not slept, but have worked and toiled for your good name. See, here we bring these tokens to you, and we are weary but satisfied that we did not fail in our task. And then I will tell you that you have traveled far, but you have come to the harbor at last, and sitting at my feet you will hear what you have not heard before, as it was right and willed that your evolution should follow the cup. But now from the east comes the bright star of a new awakening, and I will tell you how I too had to be taught the story of those who came before me, not from the Father, but from the Great Mother. To teach the dispensation, I had to go behind the walls and see the story of creation, not as it is written in heaven, that I knew, but as it is written on the earth, which I had come to liberate through compassion. The one who speaks to you was my master, though now he is my disciple, because the time had come when my Father called me as his son to sit on his right hand. You are all meant to work for unity and understanding. All the great prophets have been heralding the moment which is truly the moment of judgment, of which I spoke to my disciples at the beginning of our cycle. Verily, verily, I say unto you, receive my blessings, receive my dove, because now unity has to become the law of the earth, and those who respect it and make it their own will enter with me the kingdom of heaven. The others will be thrown to the bottom of the evolutionary ladder and will have to start again from the animal kingdom. There is no place for half men or sleeping men any more. Either you are a full man or you are no man at all. Dearest daughters, I have spoken my message of Pentecost. Michael will be with you tomorrow, and your trusted friend and guide, Azrath. Peace be unto you. Keep it in your heart as the glow of the blood which was made to flower to redeem the law.
Good gracious.
So, I mean, messages as powerful as that to a teenager needed a whole lifetime to assimilate.
And so many of the themes of your life have been inspired by those messages.
Yes, they absolutely have, because they are the foundation, absolutely, of my whole life. I was trying to find another one, but I
Well,
can't.
let's go into the next stage of your life right now, because you went to Oxford.
Yes.
You went to St Hilda's.
I went to St Hilda's.
What
I
did you
studied
study?
medieval history and Renaissance history. Those were the two subjects that most interested me. I had wonderful tutors, and I thoroughly enjoyed myself at Oxford. I had a wonderful time, both in the study
After
sense.
Oxford, you had a very difficult engagement, which began a process of deep distress for you, didn't you?
Yes, because in those days, young women knew nothing about bisexuality. And I got engaged to a man who was a bisexual without knowing what that meant at all. And just after we got engaged, he was accused of molesting Boy Scouts. And there was a huge trial, which was a very famous trial. Because of that trial, the law on homosexuality was changed in England, so that homosexuality was no longer a crime for which you could go to prison. Yeah, which it was then. He went to prison for a year.
Oh my Lord.
So I went to New York and broke
You were
off the
really
engagement.
shattered by this. This
Yes,
must
I
have been
was, yes.
a terrible betrayal and heartbreak and...
Well, it's terrible shock, because
Yes.
shock in every sense, really. And I felt humiliated, and I felt a fool, and I felt that I'd made a terrible mistake, but at the same time I loved him because he was a lovely man, really, a delightful man, and very artistic and gifted in every sense. And so it was a rupture, really, a complete rupture with one part of my life and beginning a new phase. And then after that, I didn't know quite what to do for 2 or 3 years. And then when I was 25, I had something opened up which was extraordinary.
This is really
this is
the
most
great
exciting
first great initiation after the early experience, because you went to Asia twice, didn't you? How did that evolve?
Well, it evolved, first of all,
this is so
it evolved because in those days you could pull strings. My parents pulled strings to get me to train as an air hostess, to go on a troop carrier which went to Singapore and stopped in India and Bangkok on the way. So
you trained?
I trained. Not very long, but trained enough to know what I was doing, and that was I had a ball. I had
that was your first visit?
That was my first visit. And
tell me about
then I went to Tiruvannamalai in that visit.
Yes.
And because my mother...
Well, Tiruvannamalai is in South India.
Yeah.
And Tiruvannamalai is the place where Ramana Maharshi spent most of his life. And you went, in fact, just after Ramana had died, didn't you?
That's right, yes.
But the atmosphere of this great
was still
seer
extraordinary.
was still there.
Was still there.
How was it for you? What happened to you?
Well, it was magical. We stayed with a lovely woman who invited us into her house, and she told us that we had to walk around the sacred mountain, which was called Arunachala.
Yes.
And so my mother, who had been with me in this journey, this first journey, and who was determined to get to these places in India where there were great teachers.
Yes.
And so she found this one,
Ramana.
Ramana.
Yes.
When she got to India, she heard about him. She said, "Oh, we must go there." So anyway, we arrived there, and then the great thing about that journey was the walking around the mountain. It was 9 miles long.
The production, yeah.
Yeah, and my mother and a beautiful young girl called Hamsa, who was also staying with us, we set off at dusk, and we walked through the night until we'd come back. And that was an amazing experience, because it was entering the mystery. That was what was so wonderful. It was participating in something absolutely sacred that people had done for centuries, long before Sri Ramana was there. This mountain had been sacred. And as we've been told in the messages, which I forgot to say, that we were told to look for the holy mountain, the stone at the foot of the tree, and the dream of the water. Those three things. So we felt that we were here in the holy mountain. We'd found at least one of the holy mountains. We didn't realize then, only later I realized, that the holy mountain is a metaphor for a state of being.
Yes.
But at that time we took it literally.
Well, as it was for Ramana, because Arunachala is sacred to Shiva.
Yeah.
But there was a question that Ramana used to ask his...
Yes, anyone who came there.
Anyone who came there. It's called the vichara. It's the ancient habit of inquiry. And the question is, who am I?
Who am I?
And the meditation is to peel away all of the exterior definitions of self, so as to begin to approach the vast hidden mystery of who
one's
you
own being.
really are, of the being that your being is one with.
Well, I was 25 when I first was given this little booklet which said, "Who am I?" on the cover. It had a yellow cover, I remember. And it's taken me all this time, and writing this book that I've just finished, to understand who I am and what I am part of. So that question started me on a tremendous quest for my whole life, really, and I'm tremendously grateful for that visit to Arunachala, to Tiruvannamalai, because without it I wouldn't have probably found my way at all. It was really the second stage of the quest, when I actually embarked on the experience of looking for something definite, whereas the messages that opened me up to the presence of something utterly different, to another dimension of reality. But this really took me on a quest to find out what that reality was.
Then you went again, the second journey, didn't you?
The second journey, I had some friends in Rome who introduced me to a man who was compiling an encyclopedia of art, and he commissioned me, without giving me any money, but he commissioned me to go on a journey to the Far East, to as many countries as possible, and to go to the museums in every country, ask the curators and the directors for help in choosing the very best quality of all the works of art in the museum, and to bring back the photographs of those works of art. So that's what I did, and I went again to India, and then I went to Thailand, Cambodia,
and Taiwan. You had the most extraordinary experience in
Taiwan.
Indonesia. Remember what happened in Taiwan with isn't the imperial paintings that you saw?
Yes, I saw the whole half of the imperial treasure from Beijing, which had belonged to Chiang Kai-shek. Or Chiang Kai-shek took that treasure when he left China, and it went to Taiwan, and it was in caves, stored in caves. And I had the tremendous privilege of being shown these treasures while I was there. And just that was my first contact with Chinese art. And I was absolutely overwhelmed. I was so shown the pictures of the Sung dynasty, which were hanging up on the walls, and these great vessels from the earlier, I think with the Qing dynasty. Anyway, just marvels, marvel after marvel. So my eyes were open first of all to Indian art, then to Chinese art, and then to Indonesian art when I went to Borobudur and saw the fabulous carved mountain, really, of the story of the Buddha. And one walked in a pilgrim route round that great stupa, and until one reached the top where there were these Buddhas sitting, or Bodhisattvas sitting, some of them covered with stone, sort of perforated vessels. So altogether it was a revelation, utter revelation, first of all of the absolute beauty and marvel of Asian art, Indian and Asian art, and secondly of the life of the people, because as I travelled, I was very poor, I had very little money. The whole trip cost me £250
Oh my God!
for a year.
I remember even when I was traveling.
I had, you know, by the time I got to Japan, I was really very hungry, and so I ate with the workmen in the workmen's cafes, and even then they had the most beautiful bowls, decorated bowls where they ate their rice and everything. So I ate with them. I don't know what they thought about me, but it was wonderful. And there
I think
again,
it was the revelation too of a whole another realm of spirit. You had this experience when you were 11, and then you had the messages. But as you say, Romana and Tiruvannamalai opened up an inner inquiry. And Eastern world is redolent with the sacredness of reality. And that must have been a very profound wake-up for you.
Well, it was, because every piece of sculpture was representing a god or a goddess of some kind, or a sacred experience of some kind, or part of the Ramayana or the Mahabharata.
Right.
So I really entered into the spirit of Indian art, and I then began to read the texts, because while I was in India I had time. Right. And I went to the library and I read the texts, and I looked at the wonderful, not only the sculptures, but also the exquisite Indian miniatures, which I loved and was very attracted to. And then again in Japan, there was a totally different kind of art from Chinese art that I'd seen in Taiwan. And there again, I read the Taoist texts, and I wanted to know who was the great Taoist teacher, and so I read Lao Tzu, and this opened up my whole sort of understanding of what religion was. This was a totally different experience from my early Christianity training, as it were, going to church on Sundays. It was utterly, utterly different, and expanding of consciousness and excitement and wonder. And also the people of India, I absolutely loved the people. They were so beautiful to look at, and the colours they wore. And that was actually leads me on to the next stage, because I used to go to the markets and buy saris and admire all the beautiful patterns on the saris. Well, anyway, I came back to England not knowing what to do with myself then, because I had no job. I had to pay back £250. and
how old were you?
I was 26, I suppose. And then so I thought, well, I want to write a book.
And that's when you wrote
and that I wrote the one work.
Yes.
And that took me a great many tears and struggle, and you know, to assimilate all this knowledge that I encountered and bring back that teaching of Hinduism and Buddhism. And I don't think I...
It's a massively ambitious book for a 26-year-old to write. My God, you really trying to bring the vision of the East to the West.
And I was trying to bring the religions together and to show how Christianity in its essential teaching was saying the same thing as the teaching of Hinduism and Buddhism. But somehow the teaching of Christianity had not understood its own message somehow. Yes. Anyway, I put this all into the book, and at the same time as the book was published, I had got married to this lovely artist gentleman who's been a partner for 53 years now.
Robin is an extraordinary man. He's a great visionary painter, and he's been the most amazing companion to you.
He has. He's been my
foundation. He came from a very odd and grand family. He came from the Barings, so he came from one of the great banking dynasties.
Yes.
And yet his own nature was so totally different from that family, wasn't it?
Well, he was an artist, and he always wanted to be an artist, and he had great courage, really, in pursuing that path in the face of the family background, because luckily he had an absolutely wonderful father, sensitive, caring, and really interested in the well-being of his child. And so he saw that he tried first of all farming, and then he tried Christie's, the auction house, And he would have liked to have become the first person to start a modern painting department in Christie's, which they didn't have at that time. But he was too timid and too young, at 26 or whatever he was, to go to the head of Christie's and say, look, you need a new modern painting department and I can run it. One couldn't do that in those days. So instead he went to the Central School of Art and trained as an artist under Cecil Collins, who was one of the great mystic painters of the last century, totally unrecognized and really disgracefully neglected. But so anyway, I thought that
what did you love about Robin when you first met him?
I loved his kindness, his sweetness, his gentleness.
Those are always here,
and the fact that he was an artist. And of course my grandmother and my mother were cock of hoop. They said, "Oh, bringing an artist into the family."
They were thrilled that you
They were thrilled, yes. Yeah. And they liked his family very much, and the family liked me, so it all started on very good grounds, really.
And what it's meant is that fundamentally throughout your life, you've had a companion who absolutely allowed you to be you.
Yes.
Very few women have a man who has the sensitivity and the grace to allow his companion to be completely herself.
Yes, and he encouraged me, and he was always supportive, because I had very severe depressions after we married, and I had postnatal depression apart from the other depression, and that took me into Jungian analysis. But the Jungian analysis took me into becoming a businesswoman and a designer of dresses, because that's what came out of that first analysis, was the release of the creative gift and the longing to create beauty with which to adorn other women.
You opened a shop in Beecham
Place, and I called it Troubadour.
Troubadour.
After my favourite poets of the
Provençal poets.
Poets. And the business took off. It did extremely well, and it lasted for 12 years. And during all that time...
Well, don't boast a little. You dressed some of the grandest people of England. Princess Margaret,
Yes, I did. Princess Anne, too.
Princess Anne.
Yes.
And your creations are absolutely ravishing. They're very, very beautiful and very original, because you have an extraordinary eye, and they're very romantic, medieval, mystical all together, as well as being very modern in their
Yes. Well, what I did, I had a phase when I went to Italy with my mother when I was 16, and I absorbed all the beauty of the Renaissance painters.
Right.
And I also knew about the Flemish artists. So in my dresses that I made, I used to copy from those paintings the sleeve designs or the way the skirts went or something like that. So they always had perhaps a different quality, particularly when I was using velvet or heavier materials.
Yes.
And then I would mix the velvet with broderie anglaise or muslin or something very delicate, organza, so that one had a balance really between the heavy and the light. And I loved chiffon and organza. I made many dresses in the summer in those materials. And also I brought materials from India, imported the materials from India, and made beautiful dresses out of Indian materials. So there was a synthesis, again, of East and West, and of my earlier experience, my love of art, my love of these particular painters of the Renaissance.
But it's also that I think that in your dressmaking begins one of the central themes of your life, your recovery for yourself and for us of the sacred feminine.
Yes.
Because your dresses, to me, are quite clearly worshipping the goddess in beauty through.
Yeah. And not only that, but I had wonderful dreams during that period, and I dreamt of dresses that were far, far beyond my ability to make, in materials that I've never seen before, you know, exquisite materials. And I thought to myself, who is the dress designer of my dreams? Who is making these wonderful dresses? And I couldn't copy them because they were far too difficult and beautiful to be copied. But they gave me the sense again of connection with a magical foundation, which I didn't quite understand, but was there, because they were the inspiration for developing my talent all the time. And they took me to the Frankfurt fair, material fair, once a year, where 3 enormous halls full of materials, and you walked up and down and chose things. So it opened up my life and my skill as a person who can run a business. I had 25 people working for me.
And the wild Jewish seamstress, wasn't it, the manageress?
She wasn't, yes, that's right,
the wild Jewish manageress. Hilarious stories that I've...
Who could sell anything to anybody. Yes. And then there was a cutter from Balenciaga in one shop, and a cutter from Poland in another.
Yes. With
a whole group of seamstresses, also from Poland, who were absolutely delightful women who'd come through terrible times in Poland, survived, one of them, a concentration camp. And I was devoted to all of them. They were really people that I loved and who loved me. And I think that really helped the business to thrive and flourish and everything. Anyway, to get back to what my husband was doing, he was supporting me all this time and never said, oh, well, why do you have to leave the house at 8 o'clock in the morning and come back at 6? You know, he never made any criticism. He loved the manageress, and we used to take her out to lunch. She used to tell us wonderful Jewish jokes. And we had a ball, really. It was a good time for 12 years. And then came the recession, and the oil price went through the roof, and the price of materials rocketed, the price of wages doubled, the rates in what you had to pay for the building went sky high, and I had to realize I had to close the business. And I closed down both houses. I had 2 full houses in Beecham Place, one of which I bought and the other which I rented.
All this time you were going through very, very intensive Jungian analysis.
That's right, yes.
And it must have been very unusual for a woman of your class to be in such intensive Jungian analysis.
Well, there again,
how on earth did you meet that? How did that
well,
begin?
I had a great friend, and she had had a breakdown. And when I said to her, look, I have depressions all the time, what can I do? She said, well, why not go and see my analyst, he's a Jungian analyst, and see how you get on. And so that's what I did. And he was very helpful to me. As I said, he freed that creative block which I hadn't been able to express any form of creativity before that, really. And so I was tremendously grateful to him. And during that time, just before, he said towards the end, I'd had 11 years of analysis, but all the way through the shop period. And he said, I think you should apply for training now, since the shop is coming to an end, as a Jungian analyst.
And that's when you went to see
And that's when I went to see Dr.
Yes.
Gerhard Adler,
Yes.
who was one of the 2 translators of Jung's works. And I went to him with a dream which the other analyst hadn't been able to interpret. And that was my first big dream, really. And the dream was that I was in a rocket going to the moon.
Yes.
I arrived at the moon. There was a huge structure on the surface of the moon, like the Eiffel Tower, in iron, rusty iron. And the whole area of the moon was completely desolate. There was no vegetation, no life, no animals, no trees, no plants, nothing. And I traveled through this desolate landscape in a train, in my dream, until I was dumped in a swimming pool. Now, in the alchemical sense, that would mean that you were entering into a different phase of really connecting with your inner life, with your emotional life.
With the feminine.
With the feminine, exactly. And so here was the moon, which was an image of the feminine, completely dead and desiccated. And Gerhard Adler said to me, what do you think this means? And I said, well, I haven't got a clue what it means. And he said, well, I think it's describing the state of the feminine in your own psyche, as well as in the world.
Yes.
And it's a dream, it's a really dream about the collective psyche and the state of the world, and the state of the collective psyche of the world. And he said, I think you're not ready to train yet, but I suggest you go to my wife for analysis, and then in a couple of years we'll see whether you would be a suitable candidate for taking you on. So that's what I did. I trained, I went to her for another 2 years.
What was her name?
Her name was Hella Adler.
Hella Adler.
And she had trained with Jung's wife.
With Emma?
With Emma,
yes.
Yes. And Gerhard had trained with Jung himself.
And how did you find her? It must have been exhilarating to have a woman analyst.
It was, yes it was, because she really initiated me into the meaning of the feminine aspect of the psyche, that is the deep matrix of consciousness. And I didn't understand anything to begin with, but gradually...
You said to me that it took you many, many years to get into any kind of real connection with the unconscious, and to trust the rhythms of the unconscious and the language of dreams.
Above all, to trust the dreams and to keep very careful note of the dreams, which I had done with the previous analyst. But with her it was more intense, it was more in depth, really.
Yes.
She took me into places that he hadn't been able to, possibly because there was a defense against the male analyst.
Who reminded you of your father.
My father and the female analyst I could trust more and relax more with. Anyway, in the end I trained, and that was in all it was a 7-year training.
Did you train in Zurich?
No, in London with Gerhard Adler's
And you became an analyst yourself?
Yes, and then I practiced as an analyst.
What did it mean to you to be an analyst?
Well, it was a tremendous feeling of achievement, because there was a new stage of my life. The shop stage had ended, and now I had the qualification for a new stage. And I practiced as an analyst for quite a few years. And then, when I was training as an analyst, I met Jules Cashford.
Jules.
And Jules, and we took the mickey out of We behaved very naughtily in a lot of the teaching. Sort of
I can
seminars,
imagine, actually.
because we'd catch each other's eye, and we didn't like all the sort of stuff that we were being made to learn. We found it very heavy and some of it extremely
Jules
boring.
is an enormously passionate person,
Yeah.
as well as being an extraordinarily gifted person.
Yes,
she's
absolutely.
immensely scholarly, but she's also a great translator of Greek.
And she's a
Homeric
poet.
She's a poet.
She's a poet.
And you two together began one of the most exciting intellectual spiritual journeys of the 20th century, because you two together decided to write The Myth of the Goddess.
Myth of the Goddess.
You went on a long archaeological dig
Yes, that's right.
into prehistory to find out
Yeah.
what had happened to the feminine.
Yes, exactly.
And what's so moving to me about the story that you're telling me about your life is that, of course, you didn't do that from an intellectual point of view. You did it because you really had to find out for yourself.
Yes.
You had to find out for yourself, to actualize, to individuate yourself, to become your true creative self.
To discover who I was and what I was capable of,
Yes.
and also to bring something to the culture that was utterly missing. Although women in America at the same time, which
Eleanor
was
Gaydon and others were doing
and
work.
Rhea
yes.
Eisler of
Rhea
all,
Eisler, of course.
before
and
us.
Marija Gimbutas was also doing
and
it.
Maria Gimbutas, once we found her work, that was really like opening a most marvelous door into an early society, 7th millennium BC, which had the worship of the goddess and didn't have war.
Right.
No sign of war. And she called it the civilization of old Europe.
Right.
So this gave us a historical and archaeological ground for our researches into the goddess.
Well, basically, you reinterpreted the whole history of the evolution of religion, because you said it's clear that human beings began with worshipping the divine as the mother.
Yes.
Then there was this tragic split
Yes.
when the Assyrians and the others, the Aryans, came in, and then the patriarchal religions evolved in marvelous but lopsided ways after this split
Yeah.
had become instituted.
Yes, absolutely.
So you began to give us the map for the reconstruction of the spiritual world
Of
in
what's
this vast
necessary.
crisis.
Yeah, and what's necessary now, what wound needs to be healed.
And it's the wound of the feminine, it's the wound of embodiment, it's the wound of not being in radiant connection with this as sacred.
That's right.
And that
yeah.
has been a vast massacre that has taken place, and it's often at the behest of the religions too, hasn't it? Because so many of them have
tragically,
been
they
patriarchal.
misunderstood what the teaching in many cases, and they became authoritarian, they became rigid, and they became didactic, and also they began to fight with each other.
Yes.
What the Christians did to the Muslims in Jerusalem
What the Muslims
and
did to
in
the Christians, and what the
Constantinople,
Jews did, etc. It goes
and
on
so on.
and
It goes on and on, and so they got things really wrong, all three religions, or patriarchal religions. And I think now there's a possibility that things in this terrible situation we're in, things
Well,
might
let's go back
change.
to the writing of the book, because it must have been a huge adventure for you, the writing of the myth of the goddess.
It started, I'll tell you how it started, because Jules had a dream about a ruined garden that needed to be restored. And she rang me up and I said, well, come and have some supper and we'll talk about it. And so she came along and we talked and we said, well, I think we need to sort of think about what has been ruined. You know? And then we realized that it was the image of the feminine and all the mythology of the feminine that had been lost. And she knew enough about Greek history already, and I knew enough about European history, so put things together. And then we were going to start with Greek history, with the Greek goddesses. And then we thought, no, that's not enough, we have to go further back. So we went back to the Neolithic, then back to the Paleolithic, and we found the early images, what they call Venus figurines.
Yes.
But we
Venus
realized
of
that
Willendorf
these
and
were
others.
actually goddess figures.
Yes.
They were figures that people worshipped, not as fertility
They're
symbols.
not fat women, they are the
No.
divine mother.
And you could see it as not only the Earth Mother, but also the Cosmic Mother.
Yes.
And this comes through much more in the Neolithic, when you have the great temples like Stonehenge or Newgrange in Ireland, and all over Europe you have the megalithic temples constructed, first of all, to harmonize the life of the community with the life of the cosmos.
Right.
But also you have the feeling coming through from the earlier period of the cosmos as mother. And this is just terribly important. So we tried to put this into our book, and we often got the same piece of information the
You
same
told
day.
me once that you would stumble on the same piece of information almost at the same time.
We'd ring each other
all
up.
across London and ring each other up, so that you were aware of being guided by some divine intelligence, some
presence,
divine force.
Really.
Yes.
I called ourselves one brain with two exits, which made Jules laugh, because there was certainly one consciousness guiding both of us.
Yes.
And we were in synchronistic harmony in the writing this book. We never quarrelled. She taught me how to use sentences better than I had, how to write better, really.
Yes.
She was a very good writer.
Well, she's an extraordinary writer.
And I could give her the historical background. She had the philosophical and English language gifts, and I had the historical.
But in that
sort
too,
of training, really.
it's not only one of the greatest books of the last 50 years, but it's also a manifestation of the feminine intelligence, because it's cooperative.
Yes, it
You
is.
worked together as sisters serving the mother,
We did.
and produced a book that absorbed the deepest and best of both of your talents, and created a book that is actually one of the great masterpieces of the restoration of the
well,
sacred
it was lovely
feminine.
to do that, but we had great difficulties with the publisher, and eventually because we wanted to have 450 pictures put into the text.
So that people could see
as the text went along, they could see what the picture was.
And because of your passion for beauty.
Exactly.
Because the feminine expresses so much of her true nature through the
image.
beauty of the creation, and through the glory of art, and through the radiance of the love that human beings have created in art out of adoration of her.
Yeah,
and you wanted that to be.
Wanted that to come back into the culture, really. Because with the although there's a great deal of wonderful art in Christianity, and of course in Islam, and not so much in Judaism, I'm not so sure about that, but certainly there's great emphasis on art in both of those religions. But the feminine is missing, and the feminine is missing in the Godhead. There's no feminine dimension to the Godhead whatsoever.
Yes.
And what about the Holy Spirit? Was that feminine once
upon
a time?
It was feminine till the second century.
And we found it was, exactly. And we did the research to find that it was, and that it had changed in the translation from Hebrew into Greek and Greek into Latin. It had taken on the masculine formula, really, of the Holy Spirit as an aspect of a male trinity.
Well, this was what actually, I can remember sitting in Oxford reading your book and being absolutely astonished and grateful, because I'd had my own ecstatic opening to the divine feminine. I'd had an enlightenment experience through my devotion to a Hindu guru, and yours was the first book that really explained the history, and I could tell by the writing of the book that there was a tremendous soul beating beneath it. It wasn't a dry book, it was a book of immense passion, but it was so scholarly, and it was the perfect book for me to read. But the passages that truly impacted me were your reconsideration of Mary, your restoration of Mary as the full Divine Mother, not just this good, sweet, surrendered, docile girl, but as the full mother, and the writing that you did on the Black Madonna, because there's absolutely pioneering passages in that book in which you reclaim the majestic ferocity and grandeur of the Black Madonna, and relate it to Kali and all the other representations of the dark feminine, which is a revolution.
At that time, that was in the 80s.
It was the first book to do that. And your work and Marion Woodman's work really opened out the whole territory, not only of the light feminine, but of the dark feminine. And that came out, I believe, of your experience of your whole life. It came out of the divisions of your childhood. It came out of the strange burden of having to carry the revelations that came through the messages. It came out of the agony you went through in your first potential marriage. It came out of the deep passion to express this burning creativity at your heart, and that struggle that you went through in your Jungian analysis, and you're coming to know all the repressive boundaries that had been initiated to be able to release this force that has created so much.
Oh, okay, well, you've explained it very well.
Isn't that how it is?
Yes, it is. Well, I can see, looking back, of course I didn't know it at the time, but looking back I can see that it was. And I can see what an immense privilege that I've had, first of all, to be educated, secondly, to have those messages, and the connection with the poetic soul of my mother was inspired without.
Absolutely.
And the discipline of my father, and the love of my father too, which could come through in a distorted way, but which was there, you know?
And the love of a non-threatening, non-mean-spirited and absolutely tender husband who guaranteed your being.
And also healed the wound of the father completely. And we now have a wonderful grandson that he's half brought up too. So, you know,
But
there's
Anne,
a
don't leave out
continuity
your
there.
own heroism, and I'm going to boast for you, because you being English will not say this about yourself.
Certainly won't, no.
First, you really plunged into the core of your depression. You took it seriously. You knew that it could lead potentially to suicide.
Yeah.
So you went on a grueling, long, ghastly, exhausting analysis, and you went through it twice.
Yeah.
Then you did a hell of a lot of very, very challenging, deep work in areas which you had to master that had never really been dealt with before, had never been brought together before.
I had to do the research.
You did,
yes.
and then you had to really start standing up for this in England, which is so totally hostile to any kind of major spiritual adventure. You and I have talked 100 times about how difficult it is to stand up in England and actually speak about the spirit. So your doggedness played an enormous part in this great transformation that's happened in you. You really slogged it out.
That's very nice to hear, I must say, because it has been difficult for Jules and I, because we had very little recognition for the myth of the goddess, except in America.
Well, I got that thing
England,
made for you in Sky. Remember when we did that Sky program? And that that was the first big program about the myth of the goddess, wasn't it?
Yes, but then nothing happened.
No, well, of course, but it got into the bloodstream of America.
Yes.
Because you came over to California Institute,
That's
and
right.
everybody who teaches the Divine Feminine now in America, in fact all over the world, knows that that book is at the cornerstone of the research.
Well, I'm very
Divine
pleased
Feminine.
that I was able to play a part in that, because I think it was important.
You played a crucial part, Anne. We're all indebted to it. It's a book that everybody knows is a classic. Then we met.
Then we met,
and then we did 2 books together.
Yes,
we
and
did
that was
Mystic
lovely.
Vision
You were
and
in
the
America.
Divine Feminine.
You were in America and I was here, and in those days there was no communication with computers. It was all fax.
Yes.
And it was pages and pages and pages had to be faxed back and forth. But anyway, we produced these 2 books, and we're very proud
what
of
was
them.
important for me about that experience is that it really was a sacred marriage of hearts and souls.
Yeah, working together.
Because we knew that we shared the same passion for the mother.
Yeah.
We knew that we both had been tremendously wounded and had gone on a long and fierce journey of healing. And we knew that it was essential to bring together both of our scholarly understandings and our mystical understandings and try and help people to get to the material that had so loomed in us.
And we could do that in those books. I remember
they were our children.
We had 400 pages of sayings for the Mystic Vision, which we had to condense into 365 sayings. But it was lovely to rediscover all that. And of course that took me back to what I'd learnt in my journeys in the East. Because I was connecting again with the great Hindu and Buddhist and Taoist texts. And
yes, really, and bringing them all together, in a way, bringing together your whole mind, your whole heart, your whole scholarly, intellectual, mystical understanding.
It was a lovely thing to do, really. And also the Divine Feminine, which was, again, taking the myth of the goddess further to look at the Eastern goddesses, to look at the Hindu, because your input was really from the Eastern goddesses, and also from the indigenous people, which was very important.
Very important. So we really brought together, as far as we could, the whole range of awareness about the Divine Feminine.
We did. Would you like me to read those 2 poems I wrote?
I would love that.
In the Divine Feminine.
But another thing that was really important about that book, Anne, was that we put in so many images of Robin's amazing visionary painting. Do you remember how insistent we were that we would have Robin's work there? Because Robin is as much a visionary as you are.
He's a silent visionary. He won't speak about it.
Oh God, no, it would be too embarrassing. But he is. I, of course, have spoken about him after a glass of wine or 2. But it is an incredible work, his work.
But really, in a way, the silence of it gives it greatest power, because not speaking about it means that the intensity of the passion goes into his
that's it. The paintings speak for themselves. They don't have to be.
And he doesn't give them fancy names. He just calls them landscapes with a figure or something like that. And he doesn't like me commenting on them. That I've learnt that in my marriage, that to leave him his space, because if I go in there and say it's a marvelous painting, he doesn't want that.
Yes.
He wants to be left with his painting, just the contemplative space between them, not touched by somebody commenting. Which is interesting.
Well, he's left you completely free to evolve in your own soul, and he doesn't ever interfere with what you're doing, or even really ask you much about it, and
no,
you don't ask
he
what
will
he...
read it. When the books are written, he will read them, but I don't consult him while they're being written. Otherwise, he'd be doing nothing else but reading drafts of my book.
But isn't that a sign of tremendous respect from both sides?
Yes, it is. That's what I call a real marriage, an in-depth, a soul marriage, definitely.
Yes.
Now, I'll just read you these two poems. I wrote these in Cyprus, I remember, one summer. In the secret place of the Most High I nestle, waiting for the moment, listening for the song that connects me to thee, womb of all being, divine source, lost Shekinah of my soul, immortal presence. And the other one is called The Song. Beehive source, trellised womb, mother of all beginnings, hold me, gather me, feed me with the honey nectar from the hive. Nourished, I will sing the bee song, the long forgotten threnody of praise to thee.
For the last 20 years, almost all the time that I've known you, up to the books that we did together, you have been working here in deep, deep seclusion on the book that has just come out, Dream of the Cosmos, which many of us, I included, Jean Houston, many of us believe to be one of the most important books written in the last 30 years, in which you take the whole vision of the myth of the goddess to a wholly new richness. Mm-hmm. What were those 20 years of writing this book like? Were there many times you wanted to give up, many times you felt that you could never bring it all together in the way that you have?
Yes, one of the biggest problems is that all my friends were so busy that they couldn't read anything, except for two wonderful women in California. I mentioned their names, Betty Kovacs and Kimberly Saavedra.
Yeah.
And after I'd given some talks at the California Institute, I went to stay with them for a week, taking with me my drafts of the book. And they went through it, chapter by chapter, and helped me tremendously to sort of refine it and make it clearer and everything. That was a long time ago, and I also had a wonderful editor called Joy Parker in America, and she helped me tremendously, again, clarifying and working on the punctuation and things like that, and saying this is a wonderful bit, or I could cut that bit out. And you know, as an editor, she was tremendous help. So that was quite a long time ago. That was a good, probably 10 years ago. But that helped me with the beginning stages, because as with the myth of the goddess, I was kind of not knowing how to proceed. How do I didn't make a sort of plan in advance to which I stuck, but I wrote section by section at different stages during those 20 years. And many of them in preparation for talks that I gave to an organization called the Scientific and Medical Network.
Well, they played a great role in your opening up, didn't they?
Yeah, they were a lifeline to me, because the David Lorimer, who was a great friend, he invited me to give these talks, so I felt welcomed, and I felt there was a place that I could speak, even though I was a bit way out. But there was a conference once a year called Mystics and Scientists. So as a mystic, I was categorized as a mystic rather than a scientist. I was able to speak and bring all sorts of this early material to the attention of other people in the network. And so that was really the work of the 20 years, was actually giving a series of lectures to different places, not only the network, but also to other places in England. And then also developing, giving my own seminars, which was, I should say, they had a wonderful woman called Florence Mayer, who said to me one day, you know, Anne, you're just wasting your life. You should be teaching in seminars, and we will all come. So get yourself going and organize yourself.
Were you scared?
No, I wasn't scared, but I thought, how do I do this? And then I had a very great friend called Roger Woolger, and he said, well, you can come under the umbrella of my organization, and my very nice helper, Jane May, will organize the conference, the seminars for you. We'll do all the business of taking the money and that sort of thing. And you don't have to do the sort of difficult work. All you have to do is get up and speak. So that's what I did. And so I think for over 3 years I did 3 different lots of seminars. The first on the feminine.
Yes.
the second on alchemy,
yes.
and the third on the changing image of God,
Yes.
which was the last one.
Which is really the fundamental theme of Dream of the Cosmos.
Exactly, yes.
Because what you've done in Dream of the Cosmos is bring together really everything that you've ever experienced, and you've brought it together in terms of a new emerging understanding of our relationship to the whole universe.
To the divine,
that
yes.
must emerge now if we're going to have a hope in heaven of getting through this crisis,
That's right.
which you recognize clearly to
Well,
be massively disruptive.
I recognized the crisis, but I didn't know how to do the book in such a way, except by putting it in context of my own experience.
Right.
Because that would be the only way that would be simple enough and clear enough to people who could actually see my own development as they read through the book and be carried along with it. I didn't plan it that way, but this is the way it seems to have come out. So that when I get to the God chapter, which is chapter 17, which is called New Wine in New Bottles, I have prepared the whole ground of what led to the change that's needed in our God image in the three patriarchal religions. First of all, to restore the feminine to the image of God, but secondly, to understand God as life itself,
Right.
not something separate from life,
Right.
but as every blade of grass and as every tree
Stone,
and as every flower and
every
stone.
flower, everything.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking in detail about the book, and what I want to ask you in conclusion, as this wonderful journey that we've taken through your life, is that you're 81, we're sitting here, it's a beautiful summer afternoon. What do you feel about your life at this moment, right now? What do you feel at 81 about this journey that you've taken as a woman, a champion of the sacred feminine, a major writer of spiritual, intellectual, philosophical books? How do you feel about yourself? What do you feel?
Well, I feel I've done my best. I feel a sense of great fulfillment now because I feel I've completed my life task. I've done my best with the gifts that I was given, with the education I was given, with the opportunities I was given to expand my horizon of understanding. I followed my quest, and it's led me to what I hope to find, not to enlightenment in the Eastern sense, but to enlightenment of understanding of the purpose of what we're here for on this planet. And that to me is a tremendous gift of understanding that's come partly through my own efforts, but also through exploring the work of other people working on the same thing. And I have a daughter who's just got married, who's now 50. I have a wonderful grandson of 18, just on the threshold of life. And I see my future, the years that remain, I see as being dedicated to helping this group of people on the planet who are trying to awaken the whole of humanity to a different destination and a higher goal.